When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, I thought I had finally made it. After years of saving, years of small apartments and secondhand furniture, I'd bought a place that felt like a dream. A clean, quiet suburb tucked behind manicured hedges and pastel mailboxes. Every driveway glistened with freshly waxed SUVs. Every lawn looked like it had been combed with a ruler. The welcome packet was thick, full of HOA bylaws, smiling neighbor profiles, and pastel pamphlets about community harmony. I remember thinking it all seemed a bit much, but after so long in cramped city life, the idea of harmony didn't sound too bad. I moved in on a Friday. By Sunday, the first letter appeared on my porch. It wasn't a welcome note, not really. It was a warning. The paper was tucked neatly into an envelope, stamped with the HOA logo, a little emblem of an oak tree and a picket fence. The letter said my trash bins were visible from the street. A first violation, it called it. Nothing major, but the tone felt cold. Please comply to maintain the community standards, it read. Signed at the bottom, Karen L. B., President, Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I didn't know it then, but that signature would come to define the next 2 years of my life, and eventually it would lead to fire, ruin, and a courtroom I'll never forget. At first, I brushed it off. The bins went behind the fence, and I tried to laugh about it. Every HOA had its sticklers, right? Every neighborhood had someone who lived for the rules. I told myself it was fine, that I could keep my head down and stay out of trouble. But the letters didn't stop. A month later, I got another. My lawn was too long. Then one about the mailbox paint being off-standard. Each one signed with that same sharp cursive, that same clipped tone that felt less like guidance and more like a warning. It became clear that the HOA president, Karen, wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was the rules. Neighbors whispered about her in careful tones. You could feel the fear in the way they spoke. Polite smiles in daylight, nervous glances when her name came up. Everyone had a story. Fines for tiny cracks in driveways, threats for unapproved flower beds, even letters about the color of seasonal wreaths. And yet, no one ever challenged her. Because somehow, Karen always found a way to make life worse for those who did. For a while, I managed to stay under the radar. I kept the house spotless, I paid my dues on time, I smiled when she passed by on her morning walks, clipboard in hand, phone camera ready, eyes scanning every inch of the neighborhood like a hawk guarding its nest. But one small change, one decision I made for myself, was all it took to set her off. It started with a fence. The old one was sagging, and I decided to replace it. I filed the proper request with the HOA, included all the measurements and color samples, just like the handbook said. Weeks passed without response, so I assumed silence meant approval. The fence went up. Same height, same color, same everything. It looked great. But 3 days later, I found another envelope taped to my door. This one wasn't a warning. It was a fine. $250 for unauthorized modifications. Karen's handwriting was underlined twice at the bottom. I tried reasoning through email, showing my submission date, my photos, my receipts. No reply. A few days later, I got a second fine, this time for failure to comply with corrective actions. That's when I realized this wasn't about the fence. It was about control. From then on, it was open season. Every minor infraction became a new letter, a new penalty. My mailbox was suddenly too modern. My porch light was too bright. Even the color of my curtains you couldn't see unless you were standing right at the window, became aesthetic violations. And Karen never missed a chance to remind me she was watching. She'd park her car just far enough down the street to look casual, but close enough that I could see her sitting there, clipboard in lap, pretending to be on her phone. Sometimes I'd catch her snapping photos. Other times she'd stroll by just as I came home from work, her smile tight, her tone sweet when she waved, the kind of sweetness that hides something sharp behind it. The neighbors pitied me, I think. They stopped inviting me to gatherings. Not because they didn't like me, but because being seen with me risked Karen's wrath. It was isolation by design, a social quarantine built from fear and paperwork. It all might have continued quietly, just one more story of HOA harassment, if not for the storm. A thunderstorm hit one summer evening, the kind that shakes the walls and paints the sky white. Power lines went down, trees snapped, and by morning, fences across the neighborhood were blown apart. Mine was one of them. The new one, the one she'd fined me for. It leaned into the mud like a broken rib. When I came out to assess the damage, Karen was already there, standing in her raincoat, camera in hand, documenting every splinter like a detective at a crime scene. That moment burned itself into my mind. The way she looked at the wreckage, not with sympathy, but satisfaction. I think she enjoyed it. 2 days later, she sent another letter. Structural damage must be repaired within 7 days. Failure to comply will result in legal action. 7 days. After a storm that wrecked half the neighborhood, she gave me 7 days. That's when something inside me hardened. I stopped being scared of her. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, documenting every unfair fine, every incident, every photograph I'd taken of her stalking my property. I even consulted a lawyer. I was done playing her game. But what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was how far Karen was willing to go when someone stood up to her. The night before my first HOA hearing, I came home late from work. The house was dark except for the faint orange glow of my porch light. The air smelled faintly of smoke, the kind that you notice only after it's too late to know where it came from. I went to bed uneasy, unaware that something was shifting around me, something dangerous, deliberate. Looking back now, it's clear. That night was the start of the end. The moment my quiet suburban life began sliding to chaos, to ashes.
The night before the fire was quiet in that uneasy way suburban nights can be, too still, too perfect. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air thick and damp. Crickets had returned, chirping faintly beyond the fences, and the streets glistened with leftover puddles that caught the glow of porch lights. I remember thinking, as I stood by the window, that the neighborhood looked almost unreal in that haze, like a painting someone forgot to finish. I went to bed late, the kind of late where your body's tired but your mind keeps replaying things, letters, fines, photos, the image of Karen in her raincoat by my broken fence. I told myself it was just stress, that after the upcoming HOA hearing everything would calm down. I didn't know that by sunrise there would be nothing left to calm down. Sometime past midnight I woke to a crackling sound. At first I thought it was the storm returning. Then came the smell, sharp, choking, unmistakable. Smoke. It seeped into my room through the vents, dense and oily, clinging to my throat. When I opened my eyes, the air was already thick with haze. I stumbled to the hallway, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. Orange light flickering beneath the doorframe leading to the kitchen. It wasn't the soft light of a bulb. It danced and roared. The fire had started low, crawling across the floorboards, but it was spreading fast. Every breath burned. Every second the world shrank behind walls of heat and noise. I remember the way the smoke swirled down the hall, black and alive, swallowing the ceiling. I remember the sound of glass shattering, windows, bottles, something exploding in the kitchen. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears as I made it to the front door and stumbled into the cold night air. The world outside looked wrong. The sky was pulsing orange, my house glowing like a furnace. I could hear the sirens already. Someone had called them, but the flames were too fast, too hungry. The fire wasn't random. You could tell by the way it spread, fast, deliberate, fed from the back porch outward, like it knew where to go. I stood barefoot in the street, shaking, watching the life I'd built vanish into sparks. The neighbors emerged one by one, their faces pale in the firelight. Some clutched blankets, others just stood and stared, whispering behind hands. And among them, at the edge of the crowd, I saw her. Karen. She was standing by her SUV, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The flames painted her face in shifting gold and shadow. For a second I thought I saw the smallest smile flicker across her lips. But then she looked away, pulling out her phone, recording like always. The firefighters arrived fast, but it didn't matter. By the time the sun rose, my home was gone. What wasn't burned was soaked. The fence was a blackened skeleton, the walls a shell. The smell of smoke would linger for weeks in my hair, my clothes, my memory. The official report came later that day. Electrical malfunction, they said at first. Faulty wiring in the kitchen. It sounded neat, clean, an easy box to check, but something about it didn't sit right. The house was only a few years old. I'd just had the wiring inspected when I moved in. And that smell I'd caught, the one that burned my lungs, it wasn't electrical. It was gasoline. The investigators eventually confirmed it. There were traces of accelerant near the back porch. Someone had poured it there. Someone had lit it. Suddenly it wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was arson. The neighborhood went silent. No one wanted to talk about it, but everyone knew. You could feel the tension in the air like static. My mailbox was gone, but I still got letters. Anonymous ones. Some were kind, offering help. Others were colder. Maybe if you'd followed the rules. Some people just attract trouble. The words weren't signed, but I didn't need to see a name to know whose tone they echoed. I stayed at a motel on the edge of town watching the investigation unfold. The police canvassed the neighborhood, asking questions. Most people said they'd seen nothing. A few mentioned a car parked near my house around midnight, a silver SUV. Karen's car was silver, but without evidence, it meant nothing. Weeks passed. The ashes cooled, but my anger didn't. The insurance company dragged its feet, the HOA board sent formal condolences but no help, and Karen resumed her walks like nothing had happened. Sometimes I'd see her near the ruins, pretending to check on neighborhood safety. Other times she'd wave at the investigators like a concerned citizen. It made my blood boil. Then one afternoon, I got a call from the fire marshal. He wanted me to come down to the station. When I arrived, he slid a photo across the table. It showed a small red canister, melted and warped. They'd found it in the debris near where the fire started. He pointed to a faint logo on the side, an HOA supply sticker. The same brand the association used for their maintenance tools, their long fuel, their storage shed behind the clubhouse. That was the first real crack in her perfect image. The next week, the police got a warrant. They searched the HOA shed. Inside, they found several missing cans of fuel, cleaning chemicals, and a lighter engraved with the initials KLB. The arrest came quietly. No sirens, no scene, just two officers and a short walk from her porch to the cruiser. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains as the woman who had fined us for faded mailboxes was led away in handcuffs. For the first time in years, the street felt truly silent. But silence doesn't mean peace. Not when the damage has already been done. My house was gone, my safety was gone, my life, every piece of it, had been turned to soot. And as the trial loomed, I realized something chilling. She hadn't just destroyed my property, she'd done it to prove a point, that no one challenged her and walked away unscathed. The weeks that followed blurred together. Insurance claims, police interviews, court filings. Every time I had to say her name, it felt heavier. The press picked it up. HOA president arrested for arson and property dispute. Reporters camped at the neighborhood entrance, filming the gates, the burned remains, the perfect lawns that framed the chaos. Willow Creek Estates became infamous overnight, a cautionary tale about control gone mad. But for me, the hardest part wasn't the loss or the attention. It was the waiting. The trial date was set months away, and I was listed as the primary witness. I'd have to face her again, look into the same eyes that had watched my house burn. As fall turned to winter, the ruins of my home were cleared away. The lot stood empty, just a patch of dirt surrounded by those same manicured lawns. Neighbors avoided walking past it. Some said it felt cursed. I visited once a week, standing where the kitchen used to be, where the walls once held laughter and plans. Each time the smell of smoke still clung to the ground. Each time I told myself the same thing. Justice was coming. And in a strange way, it did. Because when the court date finally arrived, when I walked into that cold, echoing room, I didn't expect what I saw waiting at the defense table. Karen was there, of course. But beside her, in a navy suit and nervous smile, was the public defender assigned to her case. And on the other side of the bench, sitting higher than everyone else, wearing the black robe of authority, was me. Because while she'd been sitting in jail awaiting trial, my bar results had come in. I had passed. And through a cruel twist of timing, a clerical shuffle had placed her case, my case, before the courtroom where I was scheduled to serve my first day as a junior clerk to the presiding judge. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. But in that moment, watching...
The morning of the hearing was cold and colorless, the kind of morning that makes every sound sharper, every breath visible. I remember walking up the courthouse steps, the marble still slick with frost, my reflection trembling faintly in the glass doors. I'd imagined this moment countless times, facing her, seeing justice finally take shape. But I never pictured it like this. Not from this side of the room, not from a position of authority. The universe has a way of twisting irony into art. While Karen sat at the defense table, pale and tight-lipped, I sat behind the judge, organizing files, taking notes, performing the quiet duties of a junior clerk. I wasn't the one questioning her, or passing judgment, or speaking for the prosecution. I was simply there, present, observing, silent. But she knew. She knew exactly who I was. From the moment she entered the courthouse, her composure cracked. The confidence she once wore like armor was gone. Her eyes darted across the room until they landed on me, and for the briefest second, the same smirk I'd seen the night of the fire flickered across her face. But it didn't last. There was no clipboard now, no board of homeowners to hide behind, just her, the law, and the weight of everything she'd done. The case was straightforward, at least on paper. The state charged her with multiple counts: arson, reckless endangerment, destruction of property. The evidence was damning. Accelerant residues, witness statements, the missing fuel from the HOA shed, and the engraved lighter. The prosecution laid it out piece by piece, methodically dismantling her defense until it was just ashes, like my home. But in the courtroom, the story wasn't just about image. It was about image, and Karen had always known how to perform. She sat there in her pressed blazer, her hair perfectly styled, speaking softly when addressed, nodding when the judge spoke, as if politeness could rewrite the past. She claimed she'd been framed. She claimed the HOA shed was accessible to anyone. She even suggested that I had burned my own house for insurance. The audacity was staggering. I wasn't allowed to react, of course. A clerk remains impartial, silent, steady. But inside, I felt the weight of years pressing against my chest. Every letter she'd sent, every fine, every smug wave from her morning walks. It all echoed in that quiet courtroom air. The witnesses spoke next. Neighbors who'd seen her car the night of the fire. Others who'd overheard her rant about people who don't respect community standards. One even mentioned how she'd once said, "Sometimes it takes a little destruction to make people listen." The words hit like sparks. By the second week of testimony, the shape of the truth had become undeniable. Her control, once absolute, was unraveling. Without the HOA title to protect her, she was just another person caught in the web she'd spun herself. Still, she tried to maintain her composure. Even as the evidence piled higher, she sat there with that same rigid posture, pretending to take notes, pretending she still had power. But sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her mask would slip, her hands would tremble, her jaw would tighten. And once, when a photo of the burned remains of my house was displayed, she turned away, not from guilt, but from anger, like the sight of my loss offended her. The trial stretched on for weeks. Outside the courthouse, the story had already gone viral. News anchors called it the HOA Inferno. Online forums dissected every detail. Some called her a monster, others a cautionary symbol of suburban power going mad. I avoided it all. For me, it wasn't entertainment. It was the closing of a wound that had festered too long. One evening, after court adjourned, I stayed late to help file exhibits. The courtroom was empty, except for the hum of the lights and the faint echo of traffic outside. I walked past the defense table where she had sat, and for the first time, I noticed the deep scratches on the wood, marks from fingernails, faint but frantic. It was strange to think of her as human then. For so long she felt like an unstoppable force, an institution unto herself. But seeing those desperate marks, I realized she'd always been afraid of losing control, afraid of being small. When sentencing day arrived, the air in the courtroom felt heavier than before. The benches were full. Neighbors, reporters, even members of the HOA board who had once worshipped her. I sat behind the judge, again, my notes perfectly aligned, my expression unreadable. But inside, something trembled. Not fear, closure. The judge spoke calmly, summarizing the findings, the arson, the evidence, the intent. Karen's attorney made one final plea for leniency, painting her as a woman overwhelmed by stress, misunderstood, emotionally unwell. But the facts were immovable. She'd planned it. She'd fueled it. She'd watched it burn. When the judge read the sentence, 15 years, Karen didn't cry. She didn't plead. She just sat there, staring ahead, her eyes glassy but defiant. Only when she was told to stand did she finally look at me again. The silence between us was louder than anything she could have said. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel revenge. I just felt tired. Tired of her shadow, tired of the fight, tired of the way she had managed to infect every corner of my life. Watching her be led away didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed through me. It marked the end of something, an era of fear, a cycle of control, a chapter I never wanted but had somehow survived. After the courtroom emptied, I stayed behind to collect the last of the files. The sunlight filtered through the high windows, landing on the polished floor where Karen had stood moments before. It was strange how peaceful it looked. For the first time since the fire, I felt like I could breathe again. But peace in a story like this never lasts long, because justice isn't the same as healing. And as the days passed, I began to realize that while Karen's power was gone, her presence wasn't. The HOA still existed. The bylaw still bore her fingerprints. The neighbors still whispered her name in that same careful tone. And one morning, when I returned to the empty lot where my house once stood, I found a single letter stuck in the dirt near the edge of the property. The paper was damp, the ink smeared, but I could still read the first line. Some fires never go out. There was no signature, no handwriting to compare, but the message, its rhythm, its venom, felt hauntingly familiar. I looked up at the quiet street, at the identical houses standing perfectly aligned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that even though she was behind bars, something of her still lingered. A shadow, a legacy of fear, the kind of
The morning I found the letter, the sky was dull gray, the kind of color that seems to leach warmth out of everything it touches. The air was still, too, unnaturally so, as though the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. My burned lot sat quiet and empty, the dirt compacted flat, a thin crust of frost glinting across the surface. It should have been the end of things. The fire was over, the trial was done, Karen was gone, locked behind the same iron gates she'd once used as a symbol of her control. But that letter, smudged, half-soaked, anonymous, was like a hand reaching out from the grave of what used to be my life. I remember crouching down, brushing dirt off the paper, my fingers going numb in the cold. The message was short, just a few uneven words written in thick, deliberate strokes. Some fires never go out. It could have been a prank. It could have been nothing. But the handwriting, the phrasing, the cruel neatness of it, it all carried that same eerie familiarity. For 2 years, I'd seen those letters arrive at my doorstep, scolding, threatening, controlling. The curves and loops were burned into my memory as clearly as the night of the fire itself. But Karen was behind bars. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone else in the HOA wrote it. Someone still loyal to her. Someone who blamed me for her downfall. That idea made more sense. Willow Creek had always been built on appearances. And for some, Karen's arrest hadn't been justice, it had been humiliation. People like that don't forgive easily. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the letter meant more than a threat. It felt like a message, a reminder that even stripped of her title and her freedom, Karen's influence had roots deeper than fences or bylaws. She'd built something that outlasted her, and now it was watching me. The next few days blurred into a strange pattern of normalcy and dread. I returned to work at the courthouse, still getting used to the rhythm of legal life. Every morning, I'd walk past my lot before heading into town, and every morning I'd see something different. At first, it was small things, a plastic HOA violation notice half buried near the curb, old, faded, but dated after the fire. Then footprints, not animal prints, not tire tracks, but actual shoe prints in the dirt, pressed deep, circling the area like someone had been pacing. Each time I found one, the prints were fresh. The logical part of my mind told me it was kids, curious neighbors, random trespassers. But every instinct screamed otherwise. There was a familiarity in the pattern, in the careful spacing of those steps, as if the walker knew the property intimately. I started keeping a log, dates, photos, even measurements. The more I documented, the less it felt like paranoia, and the more it looked like proof. Someone was watching the ruins of my home, visiting often, leaving signs. Then came the second letter. It was waiting for me one morning on the windshield of my car. No envelope this time, just a single sheet of lined paper weighted down by a pebble. The words were written in the same dark ink, the same neat hand. It's not over. You know what happens when you rebuild. I stood there in the dawn light, reading those words over and over until the edges blurred. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I looked around, up and down the street, across the neat lawns, toward the row of identical mailboxes, but everything was still. Curtains were drawn. No one moved. That night, I filed a police report. They took it seriously enough, trespassing, harassment, possible threat. But without a suspect, there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd patrol the neighborhood more often. They told me to install cameras if I rebuild. They didn't understand the irony. Cameras never stopped her before. A few weeks later, winter gave way to early spring. The HOA, now under new leadership, held a meeting to discuss rebuilding approvals. They invited me, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear of bad publicity. The boardroom was the same one where I'd once been fined for my fence. The chairs were new, but the smell of lemon disinfectant and clipped civility was exactly the same. They were eager to move on, to cleanse the neighborhood's reputation. They offered me expedited permits, waived fees, even suggested a small community assistance grant. I could rebuild, they said, make the lot whole again. I almost agreed, almost signed the papers right then. But when I left the meeting and walked past the clubhouse window, I saw it. A car, parked halfway down the street, silver, older model, but unmistakably familiar. The same one Karen used to drive. My heart stuttered. I walked closer, trying to see inside, but the windows were tinted dark. Too dark. When I got within 10 feet, the engine started. The car rolled forward, slowly, almost leisurely, before turning the corner and disappearing. I told myself it couldn't be her. It couldn't. She was still serving her sentence, at least according to the court records. But that night, lying awake, I found myself checking those records again. Then again the next day, and then the day after that. Finally, I saw it. A small update buried in the digital case file. Transfer request approved. She'd been moved to a lower security facility, closer than I'd realized. Less than 2 hours away. From that moment, every sound outside my window made my stomach twist. Every flicker of headlights across the wall made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the fear of her returning. It was the realization that the fire hadn't ended anything. It had only changed shape. The control she once held through paperwork and bylaws had turned into something more insidious. A ghost story written in ink and threat. One afternoon, as I stood again on the dirt lot where my house used to be, I noticed something new. Someone had drawn a shape in the soil, a rough outline of a square, like the footprint of a building. Inside it, written in the same looping handwriting as the letters, were 2 words: Start over. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. The wind picked up, scattering dust across the ground, blurring the words until they vanished again. But the message had already reached root. That night, I made a decision. If Karen, or whoever was acting in her name, wanted to haunt that place, they could have it. I'd let the land sit empty, untouched. Let the weeds grow, the dirt settle, the silence spread. Some battles aren't worth reigniting.
Time moved strangely after that. Months passed, but it never really felt like anything changed. The lot where my house once stood sat empty, the dirt gradually softening beneath the spring rains until it turned to a patch of wild, uneven ground. Weeds grew tall where the living room used to be. Birds nested in the corners of the property sign that still bore the faint, charred outline of my old address. Neighbors stopped mentioning the fire. At first, they avoided the topic out of discomfort. Later, it became something else, collective amnesia, as if silence could make it less real. New residents moved in, unaware of what had happened. The HOA board replaced its stationery, updated its logo, and called itself Willow Creek Renewal. They wanted a fresh start. But the past has a way of sticking to a place like soot on brick. It never really washes off. I tried to focus on work. The courthouse became my second home, its sterile hallways and quiet corners offering a kind of safety the neighborhood never could. I thought if I buried myself in routine, the memories would fade. But that illusion didn't last long. It started with the notices, not mailed, not official, just slips of paper tucked under my windshield when I left the courthouse or slid beneath my apartment door. always unsigned, always written in that same firm, familiar hand. The language mimicked HOA jargon perfectly. Maintenance expectations, non-compliance with community aesthetics, pending review for restoration delay. At first, I told myself it was a prank, someone who'd followed the story online, a coworker trying to be funny in the worst possible way. But the wording was too precise, too personal. Each one mentioned details only someone from Willow Creek could know. Then one day, I received an email. No name in the sender line, just a generic address, enforcement@willowcreekrenewal.org. The message was brief. You have neglected your property. Reinstatement of structure is mandatory to maintain neighborhood cohesion. Final warning. Attached was a PDF that looked almost identical to the old HOA violation templates. Same header, same layout, even the same font. Except for one thing. There was no board signature, no contact number, no appeal process. Just a single sentence at the bottom, centered and bolded. We never stopped watching. My stomach turned cold. I forwarded the email to the police, thinking maybe they could trace it. The officer on duty said it would take time. Meanwhile, he suggested I avoid the area. But avoidance only goes so far when something or someone is determined to pull you back. 2 weeks later, I got another message, this time through regular mail. The envelope had no return address, but it was postmarked from my own town. Inside was a glossy photograph, an aerial shot of Willow Creek. My lot was visible, an empty scar amid the rows of perfect lawns. Across the dirt, someone had arranged stones to form a single word, comply. I drove out there that same afternoon. I told myself it was to collect evidence, but in truth, I just needed to see it for myself. When I arrived, the stones were gone. Not scattered, gone. As though someone had picked each one up and carried it away. The dirt was smooth again, but the footprints were still visible, leading from the street straight to the center of the lot. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't random harassment. It was organized, coordinated. Karen had built her empire through fear and control, and even behind bars, it seemed she still had loyal followers, people who missed the order she enforced, the illusion of perfection she had maintained. Without her, the HOA's new leadership was weak, indecisive, soft, and somewhere out there, her old believers had decided to restore what she started. A shadow HOA. They operated quietly. At first, I thought it was just me being targeted, but soon rumors began to surface. A neighbor messaged me online, someone who'd moved in after the fire. She said strange things were happening, letters appearing overnight, rules being enforced that weren't in the new bylaws, anonymous complaints about lawn heights and paint colors. The official board denied any involvement. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. She'd found a flyer slipped into her mailbox one morning. It bore the old HOA crest, the oak tree and picket fence, and the slogan Karen had coined years ago, harmony through order. No one knew who was distributing them. The police conducted another round of checks but found nothing substantial. They said it could be copycats, a leftover stash of old stationery, harmless nostalgia. But I knew better. I could feel it, the same meticulous control, the same hunger for obedience, the same ghost in the paperwork. Around that time, my sleep began to suffer. Every night I'd dream of fire. Not the chaos of it, but the calm before, the quiet hum of sprinklers, the glow of streetlights on wet pavement, the faint smell of gasoline. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced that if I looked out my window, I'd see that silver SUV parked in the dark. Then one night, I actually did. It was parked across from my apartment building, engine off, lights dim. I couldn't make out the driver, but the silhouette, rigid posture, hands gripping the wheel, was enough to send me spiraling. I stood there frozen, watching for what felt like hours, until a delivery truck passed by and the SUV was suddenly gone. The next morning, another email arrived. Same format, same signature line, just one new sentence at the bottom. Rebuilding begins soon. That was when I realized they weren't threatening to stop me from rebuilding, they were threatening to do it themselves. I drove out to Willow Creek again, this time with an officer. We found fresh tire tracks at the lot and a pile of lumber neatly stacked near the curb. Boards, nails, tools. It looked like the beginning of a construction site. But there was no permit, no paperwork, no workers. Whoever had done it had vanished as soon as they arrived. The officer shrugged, said maybe it was a mix-up from a nearby project, but I knew it wasn't. The boards were measured to my lot's dimensions exactly, the same size as the home that used to stand there. That night, I stood at the edge of the property with a flashlight, staring at the lumber, the empty street, the whispering trees. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. And then, faintly, I heard it. A sound carried by the wind. Not footsteps, not a car, just the faint, rhythmic clack of something metallic, like the sound of a clipboard tapping against a hand. I froze. The sound came once more, then stopped. The darkness didn't move, but I could feel it watching. Whatever Karen had started all those years ago, it hadn't ended with her. It had only changed its face, its method, its form. The HOA had burned down my home once. Now it seemed intent on rebuilding it, for reasons I didn't yet understand. And somewhere in the shadows of Willow Creek, someone was making sure the neighborhood stayed exactly.
The first time I saw the walls going up, I thought I was dreaming. It was early morning, pale sunlight just beginning to cut through the fog. I'd driven past the lot, mostly out of habit now, some strange ritual of keeping watch over what used to be mine. But that day, something was different. Wooden framing had appeared overnight, perfectly measured, precisely aligned, a full skeleton of a house standing where there had been nothing but bare ground the day before. No noise, no trucks, no footprints, just sudden structure. I stopped the car and stared. The boards were fresh, pale, unmarked. The nails gleamed silver in the morning light. Whoever had built it knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't random vandalism or some construction mix-up. It was methodical, intentional, and worse, it was familiar. The dimensions matched my old house exactly. The porch, the window placements, even the angle of the roofline. Someone was rebuilding my home from memory, or from plans they shouldn't have had access to. I got out of the car and walked slowly toward it. The dirt crunched beneath my shoes. The air smelt faintly of sawdust and something else, something chemical, like paint thinner. The structure was silent, empty, eerily perfect. No tools left behind, no signs of work, just a ghost of what used to be, resurrected in wood and shadow. A small sign had been nailed to one of the beams, written in thick black marker. Phase 1, Restoration of Order. That phrase lodged itself in my mind. It sounded bureaucratic, cold, deliberate. I called the police again. They came, took photos, asked questions, promised to follow up. But when I returned the next day, the framing was gone. Every board, every nail, every sign of construction vanished. The ground looked freshly raked, as if nothing had ever been there. The officer thought I'd imagined it. Maybe I wanted closure so badly that I'd started seeing things, but I knew what I'd seen, and deep down I knew who was behind it. The Shadow HOA wasn't just harassing me anymore. They were recreating the past. Over the next month, it kept happening. One day, there'd be a new section of foundation poured. A week later, it would disappear. Then a fence post would appear. identical to the one that started all of this years ago, only to be uprooted by morning. It was like someone was trying to rebuild my house piece by piece, but never letting it exist for long enough to be real. And through it all, the letters continued. Always the same tone, the same clipped precision. Construction must adhere to community standards. Deviation from approved plans will result in correction. Compliance ensures harmony. No signature, but I didn't need one. The scariest part wasn't the messages or the structures. It was how quiet everything was around them. The neighbors pretended not to see. The new HOA board avoided my calls. Even the police began to treat my reports like a nuisance. Willow Creek was trying to erase its own history, and I was the reminder it couldn't bury. But someone didn't want me forgotten. One afternoon, I returned home to find a package on my apartment doorstep. No return address, no delivery label, just my name, handwritten. Inside was a stack of papers bound with a black ribbon. Architectural blueprints. My house. The official ones. Stamped and signed by the HOA, dated the year I first applied for the fence permit. My name was on the title page, but the project number was wrong. At the bottom, written in ink that bled faintly through the paper, with 3 words. Version 2. Approved. I flipped through the pages. Every room was there, every measurement exact, but some things had changed. A new staircase, a reinforced kitchen door, a crawl space under the living room that hadn't existed before. It wasn't just a rebuild. It was a redesign. Someone had modified my home. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside felt amplified. The hum of streetlights, the rustle of trees, the occasional creak of the building settling. At one point I thought I heard a car door close, followed by the faint crunch of gravel. I peeked out through the blinds, but the street was empty. Then I saw it. A figure, standing across the road, half hidden in the shadow of a tree, still, quiet, unmoving, watching. The light from the street lamp caught the glint of something reflective in their hand, metal, rectangular. A clipboard. I blinked, and they were gone. The next morning I went back to the courthouse early. I needed distraction, logic, order, the things that the law is supposed to offer. But even there, she followed me. During a routine filing, I came across a property zoning request, submitted anonymously, under the name Willow Creek Maintenance Committee. The parcel listed was mine. The attached form included the words, "Owner unresponsive, restoration approved by proxy." Someone had found a loophole. They were using the same bureaucracy Karen once wielded to rebuild the very thing she'd destroyed. I confronted the new HOA chair that evening. He looked nervous, like the mere mention of her name carried risk. He swore the committee hadn't approved any such project, that no one used that name anymore. But when I asked if he could investigate, he hesitated. He told me there were a few people who met privately, former board members, old loyalists, unofficial, of course. He called them traditionalists. Said the neighborhood had lost its standards since the fire. Traditionalists, shadow HOA, whatever they called themselves, they were operating in her image. That night I drove back to the lot one last time. The moon was bright, silvering the edges of everything. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, careful not to make noise. When I reached the property, my breath caught. The foundation had returned. Not just the outline this time, but full concrete, smooth and set. Embedded in one corner was a small plaque, freshly placed, polished, gleaming in the moonlight. I crouched down to read it. Dedicated to the preservation of Willow Creek order. In memory of KLB. My heart stopped. Karen. She wasn't dead, not officially at least, but the inscription was clear. Whether literal or symbolic, they'd made her a martyr. And as I stood there, frozen, I realized what this rebuild really was. It wasn't about my house. It was about her legacy. They weren't reconstructing my home. They were resurrecting hers, an altar to her control, built from the ashes of the life she'd ruined. I backed away slowly, the weight of it pressing down like smoke. The wind whispered through the unfinished frame, making the beams creak and moan, like the structure itself was breathing. Somewhere in the dark, something shifted. A faint metallic tap. Once, twice. The sound of that damned clipboard again. I turned to leave, heart hammering, but before I reached my car, I saw something spray-painted faintly across the curb,